So every brand you've ever loved made you feel something before you ever bought anything. And that feeling was actually intentionally designed. So let me show you exactly how this works. Picture this. You're walking through a crowded place. Everyone is shouting. One person is yelling that their shoe has better rubber soles. Another person is screaming that their shoe has speed technology, whatever that means. See, everyone is trying to convince you using features, using specs, and using logic. But then someone stops you. They don't talk about the rubber or the comfort or technology. Instead, they tell you a story. They tell you a story about adversity, pain, doubters. They tell you about someone who wasn't supposed to win, someone who got back up over and over again, and then suddenly something happens. You stop thinking about the shoe. You start picturing the story in your head. You start imagining what it would be like to be that person. See, the weird part is that you don't even feel like you're being sold to anymore. You're low-key just thinking about your own life and how this story relates. See, that is the art of the brand narrative. This is exactly how brands like Nike, Apple, Patagonia, and the North Face have been able to sell ideas bigger than themselves instead of just selling just a product. So, I am obsessed with how brands tap into your emotions. This is literally all I think about. Why certain brands work, why certain brands don't work, and why some brands feel magnetic and other ones just get forgotten. And in this video, I want to show you exactly how they do it. Because once you see it, you just can't unsee it. So first, you have to understand something fundamental about the human brain. See, our brains are basically wired for stories. So there's a concept in psychology called narrative transportation. And it's basically that feeling that you get when you're watching a movie or you're reading a book, and suddenly you get so absorbed into that story that you forget the real world exists. See, you forget where you are, you forget what time it is, you forget about yourself, and all you can think of is that story. And when a brand is able to tell a story this compelling, your brain will experience the exact same thing. 1 second you're like, this is obviously an ad. And then the next second, you're emotionally in it. And so there's actually some real science behind this. So there is a principle called Hebbian theory, and it's often summarized as neurons that fire together, wire together. Essentially, think of your brain like a massive web of lights. Each light represents a concept. There is a light for victory, there is a light for athletes, there is a light for perseverance, and then there's a light for struggle. And then you have a light for Nike. So every time Nike shows you their logo next to images of athletes sweating, winning, pushing through pain, all of these lights fire at the same time. The Nike light fires, the victory light fires, the athlete light fires, and every time that happens, the connection between those lights gets stronger. And this is where it gets kind of insane. So eventually, you don't even need the athlete. You just see the swoosh and your brain goes, oh yeah, discipline, greatness, all that stuff. See, the brand is able to create an association between their brand and this bigger idea. But this is where storytelling kind of comes in handy, because storytelling becomes a Trojan horse. See, when you're emotionally transported into a story, your brain lowers its defense. The part of your brain that says, this is an ad, this person is trying to sell me something, kind of goes quiet. See, your guard drops and the brand's message is able to slip past those defenses without any resistance, because you're too busy rooting for the hero in the story. Sometimes you even see yourself as the hero. And while all this is happening, your brain is literally releasing chemicals. One of the most important ones is oxytocin. See, oxytocin is often called the love hormone. It's released when you feel connection, when you feel trust, when you feel an emotional resonance. Studies have even shown that character-driven stories trigger the release of oxytocin. And when this happens, your brain literally signals that the person or the brand telling the story is trustworthy, even if you've never met them before, even if they're a corporation. That's why when you hear a story about someone who came from nothing, someone who trained alone for years, someone who overcame impossible odds, you feel it, right? Like you're proud of the stranger and you're sitting there like, wait, why do I even care? That is your brain doing chemistry. And so brands simply know exactly how to use this. And the crazy part is that you don't have to be a massive brand to do this. Today, anyone can tell stories through video, through images, through words. The medium doesn't matter. What matters is that you make people feel something. Notice how when Apple runs an ad, they rarely focus on product first. Instead, they focus on a person, a creator, a moment, an emotion, a specific time, and someone feeling something specific. See, you see someone creating music, you see someone capturing a memory, or you see someone expressing themselves. They show you the feeling first because the feeling is what creates the connection, not the device itself. Now, to tell stories efficiently, brands rely on something called archetypes. So archetypes are universal character patterns that humans instinctively recognize. They are deeply rooted in psychology, and they exist across cultures, across time, across history. See, there's 12 major archetypes, but I'm going to focus on 2 for the sake of time, okay? So as the examples, I'm going to use the explorer and the hero. So the explorer archetype basically represents freedom, discovery, and independence. Brands like Jeep and Patagonia use this archetype perfectly. The goal is to show you someone that embodies this archetype, to show you someone standing at the edge of a mountain, to show you someone hiking into the unknown or exploring the unknown. They show you someone chasing something bigger than themselves. See, the product here simply becomes the tool that enables freedom, that enables exploration, and not the focus. Nike, on the other hand, will use the hero archetype. Their narrative is always about overcoming, about becoming, about defeating a villain. And the key thing is that they never position themselves as the hero. They make the person watching the hero. Nike is simply the guide. See, they give you the tools, they give you the symbols, they give you the story, and you step into it. Your laziness becomes the villain, your doubt becomes the villain, your limitations become the villain, and Nike becomes the brand that helps you defeat that. And so your brain will start recognizing this pattern. Subconsciously, automatically, it creates an emotional resonance. Most people think that archetypes are just marketing tactics, but reality, they're more of like a decision filter. They are identity decisions. They should influence everything from your visuals, your tone, your messaging, your behavior, because at the end of the day, consistency is what builds trust, and inconsistency destroys it. So, for example, if your friend acted like a rebel one day, and then the next day he or she acted like a strict rule follower, then you would probably feel confused. You would probably think that something is wrong with them. Brands work exactly the same way. A confused brain will never buy. Now, of course, someone might argue, what if multiple brands are using the same archetype? How do you stand out? This is where category design comes in. Category design is the act of creating a new mental category in the customer's mind. When you think of premium smartphones, you think of Apple. When you think of action cameras, you might think of GoPro. See, these brands have defined a category, and they did it using something called a POV, a point of view. See, a POV isn't necessarily a tagline. It's not a slogan. It's not a marketing line. A POV is a belief that the brand lives by. It's a bold belief that says the world is broken in this very specific way, and here is the new way forward. So Red Bull is a perfect example of this. They never compete on taste. They're probably one of the worst tasting energy drinks in the market, if I'm being honest, but they don't care because they're not selling yum, they're selling a belief. They've built an entire media empire around this belief. They sponsor extreme athletes, they create extreme events, they literally sent a man to the edge of space and had him jump back to Earth just to prove this belief. So now, when you think of pushing your limits or when you think of extreme adventure, first brand that comes to mind is going to be Red Bull. Not because of the drink, but because of the story, because of the POV that they have established for themselves. So GoPro is another example. See, before GoPro, cameras were used to film other people. So Nick Woodman realized that the real problem wasn't better tech. He realized that the problem was that you couldn't capture yourself in a specific moment. So he flipped the camera around, he turned the user into the hero, and at this point, what they were selling was a literal POV. They sold the POV of a POV. They designed this category, they established themselves as the owner of this new category, and because of that, people didn't say, I need an action camera, they say, I need a GoPro. See, this is category ownership. But of course, there is a danger zone with attaching yourself to a story bigger than yourself. As an example, if a brand tells a story that it hasn't earned yet, people will actually reject it instantly. I mean, look at Pepsi and what they did with the Kendall Jenner ad. They tried to associate themselves with social justice, but they hadn't earned that narrative. See, the story was very inauthentic and people saw right through it. Now, compare that to Patagonia, where they ran an ad literally telling people not to buy their jacket. And what did people do? They believed them, and not just believe him, but they actually went out and bought more of that jacket. But because Patagonia had already spent decades backing up that belief, see, they had been funding environmental causes. They had been fighting for conservation. They were living that story. They weren't just storytelling, they were story doing. And essentially that builds a level of trust that marketing alone could never do. So if you're building a brand, understand this. Stories are shortcuts to emotion. Emotion creates meaning. meaning, meaning creates preference, and preference creates loyalty. At the end of the day, people don't buy products, they buy identities, they buy beliefs, they buy stories. This is how a shoe becomes perseverance, a computer becomes creativity, and a camera becomes adventure. But here's the part that should probably bother you a little bit. See, as a customer, you don't choose any of that. You don't wake up one day and decide that Nike means discipline or that Apple means creativity. What's crazy is that a room full of strategists, psychologists, and brand architects sat down and engineered that exact feeling you get when you see that logo. And it worked. It worked on you, it worked on me, and it worked on everybody else. And the wild part about that is that knowing that doesn't stop it from happening. I mean, you can watch this entire video, understand every single mechanism, and still feel the pull next time you see the Nike swoosh. Because the wiring is already there. That is how deep this goes.